Greetings, everyone. Again, it's Randy Hatchett, and I'm here to supplement the conversation on modern interpretation. I'll add a topic or so to an excellent treatment by your textbook with Dr. Stanglin leading that conversation. I think it's an artful way to describe how something quite fundamentally different in the church's history of reading scripture emerges in the modern period or in the Enlightenment, if you would. My own descriptions through the years have focused sort of on Descartes as a pattern or archetype, a model for what it means to enter into this modern or critical spirit, his notion of suspicioning and doubting everything and not accepting anything unless you can come to some sense of certainty, is, I think, quintessentially the modern spirit, and that's why he's called the father of modern philosophy. It does have to do with his content as well. He, in time, accepts a premise and a perspective that is really sort of atomistic, and I think surrenders to the very questions about science that he, I think, is dubious of and worrisome concerning. And all that to say, by the time he gets articulated his sort of point of view, very different postures in place. We don't know, as members of large communities and conversations or traditions, that we have a little better confidence in finding our way forward. In fact, belonging to a tradition and having a community and a place is actually the kind of very unsafe sources that let untrue and unexamined things into the mix that spoil our deliberations. And Descartes wanted a fundamentally different kind of approach where you clear the table, clear the slate, and you only build off premises that are indubitable, and that you strictly work then from sound inferential sort of or deductive logic, and you only draw conclusions that are based on these, again, indubitable, or if you would, undoubtable starting points. This makes every person their own judge about the content of reality. And you've got to make your own judgment. You've got to do it on the basis of reason and individual rational autonomy is the order of the day. And again, what used to be safe resources that encourage us, community and tradition, are now thought to be the sources of our undoing. And this fundamental change in perspective also changes the way we approach the Bible. This is not simply Descartes' fault or anything, but again, a new mindset is employed where we suspicion or put to inspection everything that Scripture claims, and we lose collectively as a sense of readers this sense of confidence that we most rightly would know Scripture as a participant in the Scripture story and as a person of faith. And now we have to kind of presume a third-party kind of observer weighing evidence that is strangely, again, eliminating any sort of experiential stance we have toward faith. And this posture, I think, is most concerning, and it has serious kind of consequences. Dr. Stanglin spells those out for you rather nicely. I do want to address one particular thing for sure, and that is this. I want to paint a picture of several disciplines or strategies for reading that become part of this historical quest to sort of verify the historical veracity or plausibility of the narratives that one reads, in this case, the Bible. And let me start out this way, with a continuum. Let's work along this line. After events, or maybe in light of events, on one side of the continuum, you would have some bits and pieces that take shape orally. For example, you might imagine a very effective routine or pattern of praying becoming popular and other prayers beginning to embrace it. And eventually that will be captured in writing, but it takes place in shape in an oral phase. The same might be true about a particularly winsome and effective way of telling a miracle story. Perhaps the idea is you would tell this miracle story this way to somebody who is new to the story of Jesus or new to the story of Israel. And so these miracles would be seen as maybe evidence that would encourage belief. And so an effective way of telling that story might encourage people to believe. Now, this miracle story and its retelling, again, took shape in some oral conversation, but eventually, because of its success as a vehicle, it gets captured in writing. So the first stage, there's this kind of oral stage, and then later, the second stage is a written stage. And here we have real live text. And one of the questions we want to know is the literary history of a text. And so when we come to a particular text, say the Gospel of Matthew, we ask the question, can we identify any sources used in the composition of Matthew? And the standard answer, embraced by a conservative, a liberal, and almost everybody in between, is that the gospel writer of Matthew has the Gospel of Mark in front of him when he writes. 90-something percent of Mark is contained in Matthew. It's commonplace, by the way, to also think that Luke had Mark in front of him when he wrote. A little lower percentage, but still right at 90% or maybe a little more of Mark ends up in Luke. Now, when you have this much shared material, most people think an oral explanation of transmitting this by some person famous for memorizing text or something just isn't satisfying, or at least hasn't proven satisfactory. And so the church has, through the years, looked for a literary explanation. And today, what is common is Markan priority, that Luke and Matthew have Mark in front of them when they write. And I think this is very sound. It's held very far and wide. Now, this is a relatively, I hope, harmless or non-threatening kind of exercise in what we would call source criticism. Source criticism would be the idea, again, of looking at a text and seeing if you can identify its sources. Here with Mark, we have the luxury of having, Matthew, we have the luxury of having Mark right there in our collection with us. We don't throw Mark away when we get Matthew's version, but at the same time, we're very interested in how Matthew has adopted Mark, when and where he does. So this would be an exercise of source criticism. By the way, traditionally, in recent scholarship, going back for a couple of generations or more, there's been a hypothetical documented called Q, that we've named Q, that we think might be the source for shared material between both Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark. Now, and I'm hoping this catches on, it's more common to think in terms of, instead of this hypothetical document Q, or it's more and more common, let's say, to think that Luke may well have had Matthew as a source, and that could explain the material they all share. Well, all this to say, that's an exercise in source criticism. Modern people didn't invent the idea. Augustine had elaborate theories about how these Gospels are related and which was source to which. But all this to say is this becomes then a really interesting piece of the historical puzzle. Because when you're doing source criticism, you're taking the text you have in hand and you're trying to work backwards to identify sources that might have been used in the composition of the text you have. If you've guessed right or identified these sources, then you have said something about the history prior to the text you're reading. You're doing historical research. So are you with me all together? There's this oral stage, there's this literary stage of written text, and then finally there's this last stage, the stage of sort of the author providing finishing work or touches or maybe a final editor. And that also will come to play very shortly. We have first identified something called source criticism. We've given an illustration of how that would work in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, there's also perhaps a more threatening illustration from the Old Testament of source criticism. But you will find source critical conversations all over. But many of you might have read somewhere along the way in an introduction to the Old Testament that many scholars eventually put aside the notion of Moses having written text and argued that instead there were 4 sources that were eventually combined over a long period of time to account for the present shape of the first 5 books, the books of the Pentateuch. So here it is in an unadorned, unpolished version. Early on, people identified reading the early chapters of Genesis and the Pentateuch in Hebrew, what they thought were maybe 2 different sources. One source, a little more earthy in the way it describes God, would yet use the very important sacred name, a name that is revealed in the story to Moses at the burning bush, the personal name of God. When you take that name in Hebrew and transliterate it, you would use either a J on the continent more common, or a Y. In the U.S., we typically use Y. For our purposes, though, we're going to use J because these people long ago identified a source they thought was the J source, or a source that used the ancient revealed name, personal name of God. Another ancient source, though, used predominantly another word to describe God or to identify God, and that's a general word for El in its plural form, Elohim. And so you have a E, or Elohim source, and then a J, which is the personal name of God. And anyway, that was one of the identifying marks of 2 different versions of ancient Israel's history. Now, the argument goes something like this. Under the sway of, I think, Hegelianism, among other things, there's this idea that complexity comes only after a long period of time of evolving, growing slowly. And so the idea would be this, that these 2 sources functioned independently, but when the northern nation of Israel was being destroyed by Assyria, then these 2 sources were woven together to make one larger retelling. The story goes on then next, near the end of Judah's history, the southern nation's history, when the young reformer king Josiah attempts to sort of stir things up. There is a book discovered in the temple. Some scholars think it sounds like the book of Deuteronomy. And so now we have, in addition to a J, the Yahweh source, the E, the Elohim source, now a later story of Israel's history the Deuteronomic source, the D source. And again, that is added to the mix at the end of Judah's history before they're carried off into captivity. Now, the last source is sort of a catch-all of a great deal of legislation, and it's called the priestly source. It involves these complicated descriptions of priestly duties and sacrifices, complicated. The writers would have thought they had evolved over time. They're kind of graduated like the income tax, and there's 5 or 6 different versions of them. And so they're quite complex the way they are presented, with different sort of versions and different animals offered for people of different sort of social status. And so the idea was this took a long time to develop, and it didn't develop until the exile, or even after the children of Judah had come back from exile. So they're post-exilic. And when these are all put together, they make the Pentateuch as we now have them. Now, if you didn't date these sources so late, you could still hold on to the idea of Moses' authorship or contribution to some sense or another. In fact, some of the early people who identified sources did just that. But in its current idea, this was thought to be an identification of the sources used. And when you could date those sources, you could see behind the text the long evolving history of how it was put together. This was popularized in Germany, and then in England, and then also in the States. Now, I need to tell you something very important, and that is, it is true that the people who offered this don't have a simple, straightforward view of the Bible's veracity and the plausibility of its story. They think it actually is evolving from a much more involved long process. However, I need to tell you that evangelicals pick up these methods later and use them without the same assumptions. And so it's important for you to identify these sources and these strategies. And the first we've kind of nailed down is source criticism. When you're using a text and trying to identify the sources used in the composition of that text, then you're practicing source criticism. If you've taught from the book of Chronicles, you may well have learned the great practice and wisdom of going to see how that same story is told in the book of Samuel or Kings. And you will want to see how Chronicles used its source. But most of us think in terms of the history of Samuel's and Kings, a long history from Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That long retelling of Israel's history was the source that the chronicler used to retell Israel's history yet again. That is a conviction of source criticism. Well, let's go back on the continuum by identifying something we'll call form criticism. Again, when you take a single text, you might find a little formulaic pattern, like a lament in the book of Psalms. You'll realize this is throughout the book of Psalms. And you'll realize as well it's captured elsewhere in history, in Scripture. And so you might make the observation that you think this lament got started in a pre-literary history in some oral phase, and it might reflect some circumstance of an early worshiper and prayer in Israel's history. And so if you are working from a little literary pattern that you found and working back to theorize about how that took shape in an oral form, then you're practicing form criticism. At first, form critics were really offering alternative theory to source criticism, but in time, they function like I've suggested. Source criticism traces the history backwards through all the previous written documents, and then if you can define or a little oral form, that a form that took shape orally, you might leap back and with the right detective work, offer a theory about how that form emerged in history. If you can guess about how this miracle story form takes shape or a lament takes shape, then you would have made an observation about Israel's or the church's history prior to its written form. So we can go occasionally get traces and insights into the oral history. Then we can trace the literary history. We're only documenting form criticism. If you wanted to pursue matters further, if you think you can trace this literary history for a long time, you might call that transmission or tradition history. We won't bother with that. We'll just skip from form criticism to source criticism, and now we'll look at the other end of the continuum. What can we say about the practice of editorship when a final author makes edits or an editor makes edits over sources that they've used? So let's put this in perspective for us. Again, without much sense of threat or worry for most students, we observe that Matthew adds more detail on a number of things. And for example, Mark, has this very sobering kind of understanding of the first followers of Jesus. This 12 just didn't get it. Again and again, they just show they don't really piece together what Jesus is saying. They just don't get it. They're slow. Well, Matthew does not change that verdict. He captures much of Mark's language and so on, but occasionally he adds something, and we kind of wonder why. Well, it might have just been the fact that he knew this piece of history, thought it interesting. But for example, when right after Jesus has said, you guys don't know what you're asking for, we're going to suffer, I'm going to be killed, and you'll also have to pay dearly. You'll have to take up your own cross as an instrument of your own death. This is this is the way we will go forward. Well, with seeming indifference to that, you have these apostles say, hey, yeah, I know, but when all this kind of takes place, is it okay if my brother and I were your really lead people? We want to be your first in command, so to speak, on your right and left side. Now, Matthew adds that it was their mother that put them up to it. Well, that doesn't change the story fundamentally. It's an interesting sort of thing. But when you are practicing that kind of editorship, in other words, you include a story in your story, but then you supplement it with an observation, then Matthew is acting as an editor here. And does this say anything, or can we draw any perspective from studying his practice of editorship? Can we draw any conclusions about his perspective or outlook? And some have made the observation that he might, later in the church's history, after seeing the faithfulness of these disciples, go to their death or face persecution, or the fact that they are now leading the early Christian community, and maybe doing that very bravely, he might want to offer a version that's supplemented by his later insights into passing on kind of an appreciation for where they stand and where this early skeptical story has not captured this later kind of chapters in their life. His insights may sort of soften that criticism. Again, there's not really any stake there about the Bible's veracity or the truthfulness of the story. Most people don't see it that way, at least. But all that to say, that is a practice of editor's criticism. We call that redaction, and you'll see that in your text. We call that redaction criticism. It's just our own word for editor criticism. And so these three disciplines or strategies are employed to answer historically motivated questions. From the top, you do source criticism. Why? Because you're trying to see what the previous documents were to the document you are studying. If you can identify those documents, you have the luxury of practicing source criticism. You might find a little pattern or format within a text that you might discern took shape in an oral stage. If you can offer a good explanation about why and how that took shape, then you might know something about the circumstance again of Israel or the church prior to the written document. Then, lastly, we can look a little further down the historical project and we can see how these previous sources are used and employed. What pieces are excluded, what pieces are included. And how does this practice of editorship, how does it prompt us to think about the overall perspective of the writer? So if you note how Matthew employs Mark, you might gain something into his insight. And again, these are not matters anymore of sort of just skeptical people employing these. That is the case, but conservatives oftentimes use redaction criticism. If you have the good fortune to graduate in person here at Houston Christian, the good Dr. Robert Sloan might give a short little mini sermon that he does typically at graduation, a very brief but very concise, nice little observation. He almost always reads a scripture. Despite being a Pauline scholar for most of his career, he is very able reading Gospels. I can't find what he's not able to read, really, but he reads the Gospels very well. And he reads Matthew quite commonly at graduation, and quite commonly he may make a comment like this. Now, I noticed Matthew uses this tense instead of Mark's present tense. And you think, well, okay, most people aren't paying attention about the strategy he's using, but he's doing something called redaction criticism. And he'll tell you something he thinks about what Matthew means by the way he has read the text Mark that he has as a source. In the hands of a conservative interpreter, this can be very, very insightful. Now, it is true, there were numerous people that, again, might offer threatening kind of conclusions and applications of this. That's surely the case. But I do want you to know, although source criticism has a little less traction these days, it's now morphed into kind of special attention to the genre you're using. Source and redaction criticism are still employed, and they're employed by people from the far right, very conservative Christian scholars, and also people from a much more progressive mindset or liberal mindset or whatever you want to call them. They don't always have, again, a kind of a confidence in the Bible that extends to its plausible history and its general veracity. And so I just need again to encourage you that these practices are used far and wide, and they're characteristic of modern periods. We'll look over, perhaps in a handout, some contemporary strategies, and I'll be happy to pass those along. But for now, I wanted you to have some working conversation around what is form criticism, what is source criticism and what is redaction criticism. A handout that I'll provide will perhaps reinforce our video. Thank you.